The Spanish-American War, a turning point in history. Let's set the stage. The late 19th century saw Cuba, a Spanish colony, yearning for independence. This desire for freedom ignited a fierce struggle against Spanish rule, starting in February 1895. This conflict wasn't just a local affair, it had significant implications for the United States. American businesses had invested heavily in Cuba, with an estimated $50 million at stake. Trade between the U.S. and Cuban ports, normally valued at $100 million annually, was also severely disrupted. The Cuban insurgents adopted a strategy of targeting property, particularly sugarcane fields and sugar mills. This scorched earth approach aimed to weaken Spanish control but also hurt American economic interests. Beyond economic concerns, the plight of the Cuban people tugged at American heartstrings. Under the command of General Valeriano Weyler I. Nicolau, infamously known as El Carnicero, the Butcher, a brutal policy of reconcentration was implemented. Cubans were forcibly relocated into designated areas around major cities. Those who remained outside these zones were treated as enemies. The Spanish authorities failed to provide adequate shelter, food, sanitation, or medical care. The result was a humanitarian disaster. Thousands of reconcentrados perished from exposure, hunger, and disease. These horrific conditions were vividly depicted in American newspapers, fueling public outrage. Sensational newspapers like Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. These papers, often accused of yellow journalism, exaggerated and sensationalized the events in Cuba. They graphically portrayed the suffering of the Cuban people, stirring up humanitarian concern and sympathy for their struggle for independence. This media frenzy created a widespread popular demand for the U.S. to intervene and halt the atrocities. Adding fuel to the fire, the U.S. government faced increasing pressure to protect American citizens in Cuba and prevent the flow of arms to the insurgents. The stage was set for a potential conflict. The growing public demand for intervention resonated within the U.S. Congress. In the spring of 1896, both the Senate and the House of Representatives passed a concurrent resolution declaring that the Cuban insurgents should be granted belligerent rights. However, President Grover Cleveland resisted intervention, fearing the consequences of war. He hoped for a peaceful resolution but warned that the prolonged conflict might eventually necessitate U.S. action. His successor, William McKinley, shared Cleveland's desire for peace, yet he made it clear that the U.S. could not stand idly by while the bloody struggle continued indefinitely. The pressure was mounting on the president to act. In the fall of 1897, the Spanish government attempted to appease the insurgents by offering concessions. They promised to recall General Weyler, abandon the reconcentration policy, and grant Cuba an elected Cortes parliament with limited self-government powers. But these concessions came too late. The Cuban insurgent leaders were now determined to achieve complete independence. The war raged on, and a series of incidents pushed the United States closer to the brink of intervention. Riots in Havana in December prompted the U.S. to send the battleship Maine to the city's port as a precautionary measure to protect American citizens and property. This seemingly innocuous act would soon have tragic consequences. On February 9, 1898, the New York Journal published a private letter from the Spanish minister in Washington, Enrique Dupré de Lome. In the letter, de Lome criticized President McKinley as weak and a popularity hunter, casting doubt on Spain's sincerity in its reform program. De Lome immediately resigned, and the Spanish government issued an apology. However, the damage was done. The letter further inflamed public opinion against Spain. Just 6 days later, a catastrophic event occurred. On the night of February 15, a massive explosion sank the Maine in Havana Harbor, killing over 260 American sailors. The cause of the explosion remains a subject of debate to this day. A U.S. Naval Board of Inquiry concluded that an external explosion, likely from a mine or torpedo, had triggered the battleship's forward magazine. While the Spanish government offered to submit the matter to arbitration, the American public, fueled by yellow journalism, overwhelmingly blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became a popular rallying cry. The demand for intervention reached fever pitch, both in Congress and across the nation. Even business interests, which had initially opposed intervention, began to shift their stance after Senator Redfield Proctor's compelling account of the suffering in Cuba. Religious leaders also joined the chorus, framing intervention as a moral and humanitarian imperative. Faced with mounting pressure and Spain's apparent inability to resolve the conflict, President McKinley issued an ultimatum to Spain on March 27. He demanded that Spain abandon the reconcentration policy, declare an armistice, and accept U.S. mediation in peace negotiations with the insurgents. In a separate note, McKinley made it clear that nothing less than Cuban independence would be acceptable. Spain found itself in a difficult position. It was unprepared for war with the United States, and conceding Cuba's independence risked destabilizing the Spanish government and monarchy. Spain sought support from European powers, but only Britain offered significant backing. An attempt at mediation by Pope Leo XIII also proved futile. Despite Spain's concessions, which Minister Woodford believed could lead to a solution acceptable to both the U.S. and the Cuban insurgents, McKinley yielded to the war party in Congress. On April 11, he asked Congress for authorization to use the armed forces to secure a full and final termination of hostilities between Spain and Cuba. On April 20, Congress declared that the people of Cuba were, and of right ought to be, free and independent. It demanded that Spain relinquish its authority over Cuba and withdraw its armed forces from the island. Congress authorized the President to use the Army and Navy to enforce this demand. The Teller Amendment, proposed by Senator Henry M. Teller, renounced any intention of the United States to annex Cuba. Upon learning of the resolutions, Spain severed diplomatic relations and declared war on the United States on April 24. Congress officially declared war on April 25, retroactive to April 21. The Spanish-American War was a decidedly unequal contest. Spain was ill-prepared for war against a major power, while the U.S. Army was also not fully prepared. The war's outcome hinged on naval power, where the United States held a decisive advantage. The U.S. Navy boasted modern battleships like the Indiana, Iowa, Massachusetts, and Oregon, far superior to Spain's aging fleet. In the Philippines, Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron outmatched its Spanish counterparts. Thanks to the efforts of Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, U.S. ships were well-trained and equipped. American officers and sailors were confident and aggressive, while their Spanish adversaries knew they faced certain defeat. The first major blow came in Manila Bay on May 1, 1898. Dewey, handpicked by Roosevelt for the command, led his squadron into the bay before dawn and swiftly destroyed the anchored Spanish ships. American casualties were minimal. Dewey secured control of the bay, paving the way for a military force to occupy Manila. By the end of July, approximately 11,000 U.S. troops under Major General Wesley Merritt had arrived in the Philippines, and on August 13, they captured Manila. This victory marked a turning point in the war and solidified America's presence in the Pacific. Meanwhile, attention shifted to Cuba. A Spanish fleet commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera y Tapete sailed westward from the Cape Verde Islands. Its location remained unknown until late May, when it was discovered in Santiago's harbor on the south coast of Cuba. The U.S. North Atlantic Squadron under Rear Admiral William T. Sampson and the Flying Squadron under Commodore Winfield Scotchley blockaded the harbor entrance. An army of regulars and volunteers, including Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders and the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalries, landed on the Cuban coast east of Santiago. The U.S. strategy was to trap Cervera's fleet between the Army and Navy, forcing him to either surrender or engage in battle. On July 1, U.S. troops fought hard-won battles at El Caney and San Juan Hill, with the Rough Riders playing a prominent role. Despite initial concerns about the precariousness of their position and the spread of disease, U.S. forces maintained their hold on Santiago. On July 3, Cervera, under orders from Havana, attempted to break out of Santiago harbor and escape westward along the coast. In the ensuing battle, the U.S. fleet decimated Cervera's ships, forcing them to beach in a burning or sinking condition. U.S. losses were negligible. 2 weeks later, the city of Santiago surrendered to General Shafter. With the destruction of the Spanish fleet, the war was effectively over. On July 18, the Spanish government requested French assistance in arranging a cessation of hostilities. Before the fighting ended, another American expeditionary force, led by Major General Nelson A. Miles, occupied Puerto Rico. Armistice negotiations in Washington culminated in the signing of a protocol on August 12, 1898. Spain agreed to relinquish all authority over Cuba and cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. In the Philippines, Spain consented to U.S. occupation of Manila pending a peace treaty. Peace commissioners convened in Paris to determine the final disposition of the Philippines. President McKinley faced a crucial decision: what to demand from Spain regarding the islands. Initially, McKinley had not envisioned acquiring an empire in the Far East. However, Dewey's victory at Manila Bay highlighted the strategic importance of the Philippines. Figures like Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge advocated for U.S. control to enhance American influence in the region. Business interests saw Manila as a base to protect U.S. markets in China, while religious leaders viewed it as an opportunity for missionary work. The British and Japanese governments also expressed their support for U.S. control. The alternatives seemed problematic. Restoring Spanish rule risked further instability, and many believed the Filipinos lacked the capacity for self-government, despite Emilio Aguinaldo's declaration of a provisional republic. After careful consideration, McKinley concluded that the United States must take possession of the Philippines. Spain reluctantly agreed, receiving $20 million from the U.S. for public works in the islands. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formalized these terms. Spain relinquished Cuba and ceded the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States. The treaty faced strong opposition in the U.S. Senate, but was narrowly approved on February 6, 1899. This decision marked a significant shift in American foreign policy, transforming the nation into a colonial power. Just 2 days before the Senate's ratification of the Treaty of Paris, fighting erupted between U.S. troops and Aguinaldo's insurgents outside Manila. The Philippine-American War ensued, lasting for 3 years. Filipino forces waged a guerrilla war against U.S. rule. The conflict resulted in the deaths of approximately 20,000 Filipino troops and 200,000 civilians. An estimated 4,300 Americans perished, primarily from disease. This brutal conflict cast a shadow over America's newfound imperial status and raised questions about the morality of its actions. The Spanish-American War, though brief and relatively inexpensive, had profound consequences for both Spain and the United States. For Spain, it was a disaster that led to a period of introspection and reform. The loss of its colonies spurred a remarkable renaissance in Spanish life, marked by progress in agriculture, industry, and transportation. The generation of 1898, a group of brilliant thinkers and writers, revitalized Spain's intellectual and literary prominence in Europe. For the United States, the war marked its emergence as a world power. It acquired insular possessions in the Caribbean and the Pacific, including Hawaii. The war solidified America's economic interests and its commitment to accessing foreign markets. The Spanish-American War paved the way for the construction of the Panama Canal and spurred the growth of the U.S. Navy. It also prompted reforms in the U.S. Army and propelled Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. Within a few years, the United States had established itself as a dominant force in the Caribbean, a major player in the politics of the Far East, and an emerging power in European affairs. The Spanish-American War was a pivotal moment that shaped the course of American history and its role in the world. The Spanish-American War was more than just a military victory. It was a catalyst for change. It transformed the United States into a global power, reshaped the political landscape of the Caribbean and the Pacific, and left a lasting legacy on both the victor and the vanquished. As historians and students, it's crucial to understand the complexities of this conflict, its causes, its consequences, and its enduring impact on the world we live in today. Ready to delve deeper into this fascinating period of history? Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the Spanish-American War and its significance. Subscribe to our channel for more insightful historical analyses and educational content.